This is a story of a boy who carried the blood of warriors but was treated as if he were nothing. A descendant of samurai, men who once rode into battle under banners of honor, living and dying by the code of Bushido. His ancestors had pledged loyalty to the Nabeshima clan. That legacy was his inheritance. Yet in the Japan of the early 20th century, swords had long been set aside. His family were no longer warriors. They were farmers, poor and forgotten. And the boy who should have stood proud as samurai blood made flesh was instead looked down upon, called a failure, even by his own kin. But history has a strange way of reshaping such beginnings. For that boy would one day rise from ridicule to glory, his name carried across the Pacific skies. They would call him not a farmer's son, not a failure, but the samurai of the sky. War has a strange way of creating legends. Some are born from numbers, medals, and statistics. But others come from stories so improbable, so human, that they feel like something out of myth. This is one of those stories. It begins not with a hero, but with a boy. A boy named Saburo Sakai, born in 1916 in the Japanese countryside. He was poor. He was restless. He failed in school. By the time he was 16, his family, descendants of samurai, were disappointed in him. He wasn't destined for greatness. He was destined, it seemed, for obscurity, and maybe that would have been his life. If not for the sky, Sakai joined the Japanese Navy as a teenager. At first, he was treated like dirt, a peasant among warriors, but inside him burned a stubbornness, a refusal to give up, even when he was beaten, humiliated, and told he would never be good enough. He endured. And then, he soared, quite literally. By the late 1930s, Sakai was chosen as one of the very first pilots to fly the Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter, the sleek new machine that would terrify Allied pilots in the early years of World War II. And inside that cockpit, something changed. The boy who once failed out of school became a natural. His instructors noticed his uncanny reflexes, his eyes that could spot specks of movement miles away, his almost artistic control of the plane. Soon, the poor farm boy was no longer just another pilot. He was one of Japan's rising aces. But here's where the story turns. Because unlike many wartime figures, Saburo Sakai wasn't simply a killer machine. He was complicated. He believed in honor, in humanity. One day, over the skies near Java, he locked onto an enemy bomber, a Dutch DC-3 transport. Inside, he could clearly see civilian passengers, women, maybe children. His finger rested on the trigger, and then he let it go. He pulled away. Later, he wrote that he could not bring himself to slaughter the innocent. It's these contradictions, ruthless warrior, yet sometimes merciful, that made him unforgettable. By 1942, the Pacific War was raging. America had entered the fight. The Zero still dominated the skies, and Sakai was at the center of it. He shot down dozens of enemy planes. His official tally reached 64. But while Sakai and the Zero reigned supreme in those early days, a storm was building on the other side of the Pacific. The Hellcat did not enter the war with a roar. It entered with a purpose. By the early 1940s, the skies of the Pacific belonged to the Japanese Zero. Its agility, its reach, its near-supernatural turning ability left American pilots outmatched and outgunned. Too many young flyers never came home. The Navy knew this imbalance could not last. They needed a weapon that could not only stand against the Zero, but dominate it. The answer came in the shape of a squat, powerful fighter, the Grumman F-6F Hellcat. At first glance, it looked heavier, bulkier, almost ungainly compared to the slender Zero, but that was the point. Where the Zero relied on speed in the turn and lightness in the climb, the Hellcat relied on strength, armor, and devastating firepower. Its designers, led by Grumman's engineers, built it around the lessons written in blood during the early Pacific battles. The cockpit was reinforced to save the pilot's life. The self-sealing fuel tanks meant one bullet would not set it ablaze instantly, and its 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, 3 mounted in each wing, gave it a wall of lead that could tear apart enemy fighters and bombers alike. The Americans brought not just machines but new methods. By 1943, U.S. carrier groups had grown into floating cities of war, each deck lined with rows of Hellcats ready to launch. Picture the scene: the sun rising over the Pacific, the deck crew signaling with flags, engines rumbling like thunder. One by one, Hellcats clawed into the sky, wings folding out as they formed squadrons above the fleet. Below them, cruisers and destroyers cut wakes through the endless ocean, while carriers, Essex, Enterprise, Yorktown, became the very heart of the American advance. In battle, the Hellcat turned its supposed weaknesses into strengths. No, it could not match the Zero's delicate maneuvers in a flat turn. But in a dive, the Hellcat was untouchable. Its rugged frame held steady at speeds that would tear the Zero apart. In a climb, its massive engine gave it the edge, and in head-on combat, the Hellcat's armor and guns made it a brawler the Zero could not withstand. American pilots quickly learned to fight on their own terms, never dogfight the Zero in its turning circle. Instead, dive, climb, and hit with overwhelming force. The results were staggering. From 1943 to 1945, the Hellcat became the executioner of Japanese air power. Over the course of the war, Hellcats destroyed more than 5,000 enemy aircraft, 3/4 of all aerial victories credited to U.S. Navy pilots. Some battles turned into massacres. During the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot in June 1944, hundreds of Japanese planes rose from their carriers and island bases, only to be cut down by disciplined swarms of Hellcats. Pilots described it as slaughter. The once feared Zero became prey. And yet, even as the Hellcat's dominance grew, legends like Saburo Sakai endured. For men like him, facing the Hellcat was not simply a duel of machines but of wills. Each encounter tested the limits of survival. The Zero's elegance against the Hellcat's brute strength. The old way of war against the new. In the end, the Hellcat was more than just an aircraft. It was a symbol of America's industrial might and adaptability. A machine born out of defeat, refined in fire, and unleashed to turn the tide of the Pacific. On the decks of carriers and in the hands of thousands of young pilots, it carried the U.S. Navy across the ocean, island by island, until Japan itself lay within reach. The Hellcat proved a simple truth: wars are not won only by courage, but by learning, adapting, and building machines that can outlast the storm. But even against this rising tide, Sakai kept flying. Then came August 7th, 1942, the day that would test him beyond imagination. That morning, Sakai engaged American aircraft near Guadalcanal. He dove into a swirling dogfight, his Zero twisting, turning, guns blazing. But then, disaster. A hail of bullets tore through his cockpit. One ripped across his face, shattering his skull, blinding his right eye, and paralyzing the left side of his body. Most pilots would have died instantly or spiraled into the sea, but somehow, impossibly, Sakai held on. Picture this: half-blinded, blood pouring down his face, his body convulsing, his mind slipping toward darkness. And yet, with one good eye, one good hand, and sheer willpower, he turned his crippled Zero toward home. The flight back was 4 hours long. 4 hours, flying on the edge of consciousness, barely able to breathe, drifting in and out of awareness. He later recalled that every minute felt like a lifetime. At one point, he considered crashing his plane into an American ship, an early thought of kamikaze, but he decided no, he would live. And so he did. He landed, barely. When his comrades pulled him from the cockpit, they were stunned. He was not supposed to be alive. The wound scarred him forever. He would never regain sight in his right eye. But he recovered, and, astonishingly, he returned to flying. Even with half his vision, he kept fighting until the final days of the war. But here's the twist that few expect. After Japan's defeat, Saburo Sakai's life took a turn as dramatic as his wartime survival. He gave up violence. The ace who once hunted men in the skies became a Buddhist. He spoke openly about peace, about the futility of killing. He met with American veterans, even the families of those he once fought against. And many who met him were surprised. This wasn't a bitter man or a monster. It was a man who had seen the absolute edge of human endurance and had come back humbled. When he died in 2000 at the age of 84, his funeral was attended not just by Japanese comrades, but by Americans too, former enemies, now friends. So what do we make of Saburo Sakai? A samurai spirit reborn in the age of machines, a man capable of ruthless combat and unexpected mercy. A survivor who turned agony into legend. Perhaps his story reminds us of something simple but profound. That history's greatest figures are not the ones without flaws or pain or contradictions, but the ones who carry them and still find a way forward. In the end, Sakai was not just an ace. He was a man who lived through the storm, saw humanity at its darkest, and chose, despite everything, to live in the light. And maybe that's the part worth remembering most.